there is a profound and often painful realization that awaits every sincere seeker on the path of consciousness expansion, a truth so stark and uncompromising that most prefer to avoid it altogether rather than face its implications. It is this: the more authentic you become, the more genuinely you embody your expanded awareness, the more you will discover that you do not win hearts through your transformation. Instead, you activate something far more primal and unsettling in those around you. You activate their deepest fears about themselves, about the possibilities they have chosen not to explore, about the cages they have willingly entered and carefully locked from the inside. Picture, if you will, a person who has spent their entire life in a dimly lit room, convinced that this twilight existence represents the fullness of reality. They have arranged their furniture just so, learned to navigate the shadows, created meaning and purpose within these familiar confines. Then suddenly someone walks in carrying a brilliant light, not to mock their darkness but simply because they have discovered there is more to existence than what these four walls contain. The light bearer has no intention of forcing anyone to leave their comfortable room, no agenda to prove anyone wrong. They simply carry the light because they can no longer pretend they do not see it. But what happens in that moment when the light illuminates the room? Does the person dwelling in twilight feel gratitude for this expanded vision? Does their heart open with joy at the revelation of new possibilities? Sometimes yes, but more often than not, something entirely different occurs. The light reveals not just new possibilities, but also the limitations that were previously invisible, the boundaries that had seemed natural and inevitable, the compromises that had been made with reality itself. And in that revelation, fear is born. Not fear of the light itself, but fear of what accepting that light might mean for the carefully constructed life they have built in the shadows. This is the lonely reality that every genuine seeker must eventually confront. Your growth, your expansion, your increasing alignment with truth does not automatically inspire others to grow alongside you. Instead, it often serves as a mirror that reflects back to them their own unlived possibilities, their own abandoned dreams, their own conscious choices to remain small in a universe that offers infinite expansion. And when people see in you what they fear to become in themselves, when your very presence reminds them of roads not taken and doors deliberately closed, you become not an inspiration, but a threat to their carefully maintained equilibrium. The mystics and wisdom teachers throughout history have spoken of this phenomenon in various ways. They knew that truth has a peculiar quality of disturbing the peace of those who have made their peace with illusion. When you begin to live from a place of expanded consciousness, when you start to embody authentic presence in a world that often rewards performance, when you choose depth over surface in a culture that celebrates the shallow, you inevitably become a walking question mark in the lives of those who have settled for answers that no longer satisfy their souls. Consider the person who has spent decades climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating status and possessions, defining themselves through external achievements, only to encounter someone who has stepped off that ladder entirely and discovered a different way of measuring success. The encounter does not usually result in admiration or curiosity about this alternative path. More often it triggers a defensive response, a need to justify their choices, to diminish the validity of this different way of being, to explain why such a path could never work, could never be practical, could never lead to real fulfillment. I want to pause for a moment and ask you directly, when was the moment you realized that your spiritual growth was not making you more popular, more understood, more easily accepted by those around you? That specific instant when you discovered that the more authentic you became, the more isolated you felt from people who once seemed to understand you, the moment when you realized that you had crossed some invisible threshold and could no longer participate in conversations, pursuits, or relationships with the same unconscious enthusiasm you once possessed? I know this experience can be profoundly disorienting. You embark on a spiritual journey expecting that growth will make you more lovable, more accepted, more able to connect with others. Instead, you discover that expansion often leads to a kind of existential loneliness that few discuss, and even fewer understand. You find yourself looking at friends, family members, colleagues, and realizing that your growth has created a gap that seems impossible to bridge without either pretending to be someone you are no longer, or asking them to grow in ways they are not ready to embrace. The most challenging aspect of this realization is not the isolation itself, but the recognition that you cannot force understanding, cannot create readiness where none exists, cannot win hearts through the sheer authenticity of your transformation. In fact, the more genuine you become, the more you may find that you activate ancient fears in others about losing control, about facing their own unlived potential, about stepping into the unknown territories of consciousness that you have begun to explore. I want you to know that this experience of activating fear rather than winning hearts is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is not an indication that you should hide your light, diminish your growth, or pretend to be less aware than you have become. Your journey matters. Your expansion creates ripples in the field of consciousness that extend far beyond what you can perceive, and your willingness to grow despite the loneliness it sometimes brings is a gift to the collective evolution of human awareness. That is why I would like to invite you to share a fragment of your experience in the comments below. You can simply copy this phrase and complete it. I realized I was activating fear rather than winning hearts when, by sharing your experience, you not only validate your own journey but also extend recognition to someone else who might be watching this video feeling like they are alone in this strange territory of growth that seems to isolate rather than connect. Your comment might be exactly the confirmation someone needs to understand that they are not losing their mind, that they are not failing at spiritual development, that this activation of fear in others is actually a sign that something authentic and powerful is happening within them. This invisible community of conscious beings, scattered throughout the world, strengthens every time we acknowledge the real challenges of the path, not just its rewards. Like solitary fires burning on distant mountains, when we recognize each other across the landscape of consciousness, we form a constellation of authentic seekers who understand both the beauty and the burden of waking up in a world that often prefers to remain asleep. Now let us continue our exploration of why authentic spiritual development so often triggers fear in others, and how to navigate this terrain with wisdom and compassion. The fear that your growth activates in others is not arbitrary or unreasonable. It springs from a very real understanding, often unconscious but nonetheless accurate, that consciousness is not neutral territory. When someone encounters a person who has genuinely expanded their awareness, who has tasted freedoms they did not know were possible, who has stepped beyond the boundaries of conventional thinking and feeling, they are confronted with the reality that these boundaries were never as fixed or necessary as they had believed. This recognition can be profoundly threatening to someone who has built their entire sense of safety and identity around the assumption that these limitations were simply the nature of reality itself. Think of the person who has spent their entire adult life in a marriage that has become a comfortable but passionless routine, who encounters someone radiant with the aliveness that comes from authentic self-expression and deep inner work. The encounter does not usually inspire thoughts of how wonderful it must be to feel so alive. Instead, it often triggers a complex mix of emotions: envy, masked as judgment, fear disguised as criticism, and a desperate need to prove that such aliveness is either impossible, impractical, or ultimately selfish and irresponsible. The same dynamic occurs when someone who has learned to trust their intuition, to make decisions from their inner knowing rather than external approval, encounters those who still depend entirely on conventional wisdom and social validation for their choices. The person operating from inner guidance becomes a walking reminder that there are other ways to navigate life, other sources of wisdom, other criteria for making decisions. And for someone who has never learned to trust their own inner voice, this can be deeply unsettling. What we are witnessing in these encounters is not personal animosity, though it may manifest as such. We are witnessing the collision between two different operating systems of consciousness. One system is based on the assumption that reality is fixed, that possibilities are limited, that safety comes from conformity and control. The other system has discovered that reality is far more fluid than it appears, that possibilities are infinite, and that true safety comes from alignment with the deeper currents of existence, rather than resistance to them. The person operating from the first system is not wrong or bad or unconscious by choice. They are simply working with the information and tools they currently have available. But when they encounter someone operating from the second system, it activates a deep anxiety about the implications of such a discovery. If reality is indeed more fluid than they believed, if possibilities are indeed infinite, if safety comes from trust rather than control, then what does that mean for all the compromises they have made, all the dreams they have abandoned, all the passion they have surrendered in the name of being realistic and responsible? This is why your spiritual growth often feels less like a gift to others and more like a challenge to their entire worldview. You are not simply becoming a better version of yourself. You are becoming living proof that the limitations they have accepted are not as inevitable as they once believed. You are demonstrating through your very presence that transformation is possible, that consciousness can expand, that life can be lived from a place of trust rather than fear, presence rather than performance, authenticity rather than conformity. And this demonstration, no matter how gentle and non-judgmental you attempt to make it, inevitably raises uncomfortable questions for those who encounter it. Questions like, If this person can break free from patterns that seemed unchangeable, what patterns in my own life am I maintaining simply out of habit or fear? If this person can find meaning and purpose outside of conventional definitions of success, what does that say about my own pursuit of external validation? If this person can navigate uncertainty with grace and trust, what does that reveal about my need to control every aspect of my existence? These questions are not comfortable to contemplate. They require a willingness to examine the foundations upon which one's life has been built, to consider that some of those foundations might be less solid than previously imagined. For many people, it feels safer to dismiss the questioner than to engage with the questions, easier to find fault with the messenger than to consider the implications of the message. This is the paradox that every sincere spiritual seeker must learn to navigate. The very qualities that make you more authentically yourself, more aligned with truth, more capable of love and presence, are also the qualities that can trigger the deepest fears and resistances in others. Your peace can make others aware of their anxiety. Your joy can highlight their numbness. Your freedom can illuminate their self-imposed cages. Your trust can reveal their need to control. Your presence can expose their performance. None of this means you should dim your light or apologize for your growth. It simply means you need to understand the dynamics at play so that you can navigate them with wisdom and compassion rather than confusion and hurt. When someone reacts with fear or hostility to your transformation, they are not really reacting to you. They are reacting to what your transformation represents, to the possibilities it suggests, to the questions it raises about their own choices and limitations. Understanding this can free you from taking such reactions personally, from interpreting them as evidence that something is wrong with your path or your progress. The fear you activate in others is not about your inadequacy. It is about your potency. It is about the power of authentic presence to disturb the peace of those who have made their peace with inauthenticity. But this understanding also comes with a responsibility. If your growth activates fear in others, if your presence raises uncomfortable questions about their choices and limitations, then you have an obligation to embody that growth with humility and compassion. You are not called to be superior or condescending, not invited to become evangelical about your discoveries, not meant to force others to grow at your pace or in your direction. Instead, you are called to be a living example of what becomes possible when consciousness is allowed to expand, when truth is chosen over comfort, when love is prioritized over fear. You are invited to demonstrate through your way of being that transformation is possible, that growth is available to everyone, that the cages people find themselves in are not as permanent as they might believe. This demonstration requires enormous patience and compassion because the fear your growth activates in others often manifests as criticism, judgment, attempts to pull you back into familiar patterns, or efforts to convince you that your path is wrong, dangerous, or selfish. Learning to remain centered in the face of such reactions, to continue growing despite the discomfort it sometimes causes in relationships, to trust your expansion even when it seems to isolate you from those you care about, requires a profound commitment to your own development and an equally profound trust in the larger process of evolution that is occurring through you. There comes a point in every authentic spiritual journey when you must choose between the approval of others and the approval of your own soul, between fitting in and being true, between making others comfortable and honoring your own growth. This choice is not made once but repeatedly, in countless moments and situations, as you discover again and again that you cannot serve two masters. You cannot be authentic and agreeable, expanded and unchanged, awake and asleep, transformed and exactly the same. The loneliness that accompanies this choice is real and sometimes overwhelming. To watch relationships change or end because you can no longer participate in them from your old level of consciousness, to feel misunderstood by people who once seemed to know you completely, to realize that your growth has created distances that cannot be bridged through explanation or effort, requires a profound trust that you are being guided by something larger than your need for human approval. Yet in this very loneliness lies the seeds of a much deeper connection, not with people who understand your specific journey, but with the universal process of growth itself. When you accept that your expansion may activate fear in others rather than winning their hearts, you free yourself from the impossible task of growing in a way that makes everyone comfortable. You liberate yourself from the exhausting effort of managing other people's reactions to your transformation. You discover that the approval you truly seek is not external but internal, not from others but from the deepest truth within yourself. This shift in orientation changes everything. Instead of measuring the value of your growth by how others respond to it, you begin to measure it by how aligned you feel with your own authentic nature. Instead of seeking validation for your expansion from those who may not be capable of understanding it, you learn to find validation in the inner peace, clarity, and aliveness that arise from living in integrity with your deepest knowing. From this place of inner validation comes a different kind of relationship with others, one based not on the need for approval or understanding, but on genuine compassion for the human condition in all its complexity. You begin to see that those who react with fear to your growth are not your enemies but fellow travelers who are simply at a different stage of the journey. Their fear is not really about you, but about their own relationship with possibility, change, and the unknown. This perspective allows you to remain open and loving even when others cannot receive your love in the way you offer it. It enables you to continue sharing your authentic self even when that sharing activates discomfort or resistance. It empowers you to trust the process of growth both in yourself and others, knowing that everyone awakens in their own time and in their own way, that consciousness cannot be forced or hurried, that the seeds of transformation are planted not through argument or persuasion, but through the simple presence of someone who has dared to grow beyond the boundaries of the conventional. In time, you may discover that the very people who initially reacted with fear to your transformation begin to soften, to become curious about the changes they see in you, to ask tentative questions about your journey, not because you convinced them or won them over, but because sustained exposure to authentic presence has a way of gradually dissolving the defenses that fear erects. Like water eventually wearing smooth the roughest stone, continuous exposure to genuine love and authenticity can slowly melt even the most hardened resistance. But this softening cannot be your goal or expectation. It must be received as a gift when it occurs, not demanded as proof that your growth is valid or valuable. The moment you make other people's acceptance the measure of your spiritual progress, you have compromised the very authenticity that makes genuine transformation possible. You have returned to seeking external validation for internal development, to making your expansion contingent upon factors outside your control. The deepest wisdom on this path is learning to grow for its own sake, to expand consciousness because expansion is the natural movement of life itself, to become more authentic because authenticity brings you into alignment with the fundamental nature of existence. When your growth is internally motivated rather than externally validated, when your transformation serves your own deepening rather than others' approval, you become unshakable in your commitment to evolution regardless of how others respond to it. This unshakable commitment to growth, this willingness to activate fear in others rather than compromising your authenticity to win their hearts, creates a quality of presence that is both powerful and peaceful. You no longer carry the anxious energy of someone who needs others to understand and approve of their journey. Instead, you embody the calm confidence of someone who has found their center in truth rather than opinion, in inner knowing rather than external validation, in alignment with life's evolutionary impulse rather than resistance to it. From this centered place, your very presence becomes the invitation rather than a challenge, a doorway rather than a wall, a possibility rather than a threat. Not because you have learned to make others comfortable with your growth, but because you have learned to be comfortable with your growth regardless of others' reactions to it. This comfort with your own expansion creates space for others to become comfortable with it as well, not as a requirement, but as a natural byproduct of authentic presence. The fear that your growth initially activated in others may gradually transform into curiosity, respect, or even admiration, but these shifts in perception are not achievements to be celebrated as much as natural consequences of sustained authenticity. When you stop trying to win hearts and simply focus on remaining true to your own evolutionary impulse, you discover that the hearts most worth winning are drawn to truth rather than performance, to authenticity rather than agreeability, to genuine presence rather than careful presentation. But perhaps the most profound discovery of all is that the heart most worth winning is your own. When you learn to love and approve of yourself through all the stages and challenges of growth, when you become your own source of validation and support, when you trust your own inner knowing more than others' opinions of your journey, you discover a love so complete and unconditional that it transforms your relationship not just with yourself, but with everyone you encounter. This self-love is not narcissistic or selfish. It is the foundation from which genuine love for others becomes possible. When you are no longer seeking from others what you can only give to yourself, when you are no longer dependent on external validation for your sense of worth and direction, you become truly free to love others without agenda, to support their growth without attachment to outcomes, to remain open and compassionate even when they cannot receive what you offer. And in this freedom to love without attachment, you may discover that you do indeed begin to win hearts, not through compromising your authenticity, but through embodying it so completely that it becomes infectious. Not through making yourself agreeable to others, but through becoming so aligned with truth that others are inspired to seek their own alignment. Not through avoiding the activation of fear, but through moving through that fear into something deeper and more enduring. Trust the process. Trust your growth and trust that life in its infinite intelligence is guiding you exactly where you need to go. The fear that your expansion activates in others is not an error in the system but an essential part of how consciousness evolves, how new possibilities are introduced into the world, how the boundaries of what is considered normal and possible are gradually expanded. You are not meant to win hearts through diminishing yourself, but through becoming so authentically yourself that you give others permission to do the same. What emerges from this commitment to authentic growth, despite the fear it may activate in others, is much more beautiful, much more free, much more alive than what is lost in the process. The relationships that cannot survive your transformation were built on foundations too fragile to support real intimacy anyway. The approval that is withdrawn when you stop performing was never really about you, but about your willingness to remain small enough to fit into others' comfort zones. And when you finally accept that growth activates fear before it inspires love, that authenticity threatens before it attracts, that consciousness expansion disturbs before it illuminates, you realize that you have always been free to choose truth over comfort, depth over surface, evolution over stagnation. The fear others experience in response to your growth is not your fear to manage, and their resistance to your transformation is not your resistance to overcome. If these reflections on activating fear rather than winning hearts have touched something within you, know that you are not alone in navigating this challenging terrain of authentic growth. This path of consciousness expansion often feels isolating when those around you cannot understand the transformations you are experiencing, when your very presence seems to disturb the peace of others rather than bringing them joy. It is precisely for this reason that we have created this sanctuary for seekers like you, this refuge for those who have discovered that genuine spiritual development is not always popular or easily understood. By subscribing to the channel, you become part of an invisible community of people who, like you, have learned that growth sometimes activates fear in others before it activates love. Each new exploration we share is like a beacon for those navigating the sometimes lonely waters of consciousness expansion, offering perspectives on how to remain authentic without becoming hardened, how to continue growing without becoming isolated, how to embody your expansion with wisdom and compassion. We are not here to offer easy answers or false promises about how spiritual development will make you universally loved and understood. We are here to explore together the real challenges and genuine rewards of the path, to validate your experience when the world around you cannot comprehend it, to remind you that your growth matters even when it disturbs others, especially when it disturbs others. If you feel you are activating something ancient and fearful in those around you simply by being authentically yourself, if you perceive that your expansion creates discomfort for others who prefer you remain unchanged, this channel is your sanctuary. Subscribe and allow yourself to be nourished by reflections that honor both the difficulty and the necessity of growing beyond the limitations that once defined your reality. Together we form a constellation of conscious beings who understand that true love is not won through conformity, but through the courage to be authentic, despite the fear it sometimes activates in others. A simple click on the subscription button is a quiet affirmation that says, I choose growth over approval, truth over comfort, evolution over stagnation. And that, in a world that often demands we remain small to keep others comfortable, is an act of profound courage and love.